Hi guys, I'm going to record another Christmas video, just turning out another one before the holidays. There's yet another challenge that comes up this time of year. It has come up, at least to my knowledge, again, recording the virgin birth and the record of the Gospels. Now, I thought about just writing an article for this, but to be honest, if you've ever read the articles on the blog or the website as it is now, they're only about 2 pages, 3 pages long if you were to read the whole thing. But that's over a day's worth of research, and it's a couple hours or more of writing. And I just think it'd be quicker to talk to you one-on-one with this one. Now, the challenge that we see coming up is often that saying that, well, only 2 Gospels, Matthew and Luke, record the virgin birth. Mark and John don't. Because only 2 Gospels recorded, it's either A, not important, or B, a legendary embellishment that's been inserted later on. So what do we do with that? Because it is a true statement. Only Matthew and Luke record the Gospels. It's not like Mark records the virgin birth in the Gospels. Excuse me. It's not like Mark records the virgin birth and John doesn't record the virgin birth. So how do we respond to that? One thing I want to point out, as far as John is concerned, and we'll come back to John in a minute, is that if you're going to argue from the position that because the Gospels only record the birth of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, therefore it's a legendary embellishment, you're going to have a really hard time arguing that from the lack of the birth narrative in John. John, and as I believe and a lot of scholarship does, was written in AD 90. Now, some would argue a little earlier, but I think the most convincing argument is for AD 90. So you're talking at least 30 years past the recording of the Synoptic Gospels. So if anybody should have a legendary embellishment regarding the birth of Christ, it would be John. He would be writing later. Secondly, some would argue that Matthew was actually the first gospel recorded. Now, that's not a hugely popular position, but there is argument for that, in which case Mark would have followed Matthew, and Matthew does include the virgin birth. So again, if you could argue for Matthean priority, then that argument of a legendary embellishment falls apart. But even if that isn't the case, even if Mark does come first, and Mark is has priority over the Gospels as far as order, you're still falling away from the legendary embellishment. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because by the standards of ancient history and record keeping and legend that do seep into historical inquiry, it generally takes about 200 years before you see legendary embellishments be inserted into the record of a figure of note. Why 200 years? Well, in 200 years' time, you have pretty much a guarantee that no one that knew the person would be alive to refute the legend. Now, all of the Gospels are written within the lifetime of the people who are closest to Jesus. The people that were closest to Mary, the people that were closest to even Joseph. So, to insert a legendary embellishment in Matthew or Luke within 30 years of the death of Christ would be rather bold, especially considering how many people would come out of the woodwork to challenge that. And you'll even notice that in the Gospels, Mark included, people still question the birth of Christ, and that's included in there. So this type of embarrassing detail simply adds to the validity that what they recorded was considered fact or truth by the people who were closest to the events. So why doesn't Mark record the virgin birth? Well, he does record the birth in a sense, but indirectly. In Mark chapter 6, verse 3, Jesus is in the process of speaking to people in his hometown, and the people in the area are puzzled by what he's saying and they say in verse 3, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and his sisters who are among us? So they know who he is, and they acknowledge he was born from Mary. The same thing that Matthew acknowledges, that he was born from Mary. The same thing that Luke acknowledges, that he was born from Mary. So that part of the birth story is all the same. That's completely united. He doesn't say the Virgin Mary, and that's one of 2 possibilities. The first argument, of course the skeptical argument, is that's because she wasn't a virgin. And the virgin birth narrative is a legend, which we've just kind of brought that up. But the other possibility is that it wasn't necessary at the time. Either it was an accepted fact or it didn't fit the purpose of Mark when he was writing. So why wouldn't it fit his purpose? Well, most believe that Mark recorded his gospel from the message of Peter. Papias, early church father, who was closest to these apostles, records that John Mark followed with Peter and recorded his recollections of Jesus' ministry. So technically the gospel according to Mark would be more like the gospel according to Peter. Mark would just have been his scribe. Now we do know that John Mark traveled with Peter. We know he traveled with Paul and Barnabas, and we read about that in the book of Acts. So that does hold weight in the historical evidence that we have regarding that. And there's really no reason to doubt that, especially since the narrative in Mark fits the gospel presentation that Peter gives in the book of Acts. So we have that unity, and the fact that everything in Mark happens right away. The Greek word for immediately appears all over the place in Mark. And immediately Jesus went here, and immediately this happened, and then this happened. So it's hitting major points of the message. Now, for Peter, who knew Jesus intimately, he was one of his inner circle and was there for every single miraculous event, it would make sense that for him, the number one message that had to be relayed was Jesus' ministry and his death and resurrection. So what we find in the Gospel of Mark is exactly that. It starts with Jesus' ministry. It goes on through the major events and the clashes with the Jewish people, and then culminates in the resurrection, or it culminates in the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. So with Peter's point and his purpose, this sense of expediency, to get the gospel out, to get it out quickly and get the message and the most important facts of the message to the people, the birth narrative was not central. It was not something that he felt had to be done. And like I said, and that could be because it was an accepted fact in Christian communities, or for Peter's audience, he didn't feel that that was going to be something they had to know right then. It would have been something that was probably presented orally already, but it wasn't something he felt needed to be written down. The main point with Mark, and the fact that the virgin birth is not recorded there, is simply the adage of this, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because Mark doesn't record the virgin birth does not become evidence that the virgin birth A didn't happen, or B wasn't known or challenged or anything like that. You have to read that presupposition into it. You see, all we have before us is an author who felt the most important things at the time of his writing was to get out the message of what Jesus did and his death and resurrection. Matthew wrote to a Jewish audience, an audience whose main focus was on ancestry and lineage, and that was important in how they valued a person, and so he recorded the birth narrative as part of that lineage to demonstrate not only that he was from the line of David, but that his birth was something miraculous, something that would have been heralded by the heavens, and that's an important thing. So that's why Mark doesn't record it. Let's ask why John does. What about John? Why didn't John record the birth narrative like Matthew did? Why leave it out? Well, actually, what you're going to find in John is that he does mention the birth of Christ, but he does it kind of like Mark does, in a unique way, and it's a way that is just like John. He does it in a way that's so full of meaning that you just have to see it to appreciate it. So let me see if I can show you what I mean and how John makes reference to the birth of Christ. In John 1:1, we read the very famous passage that says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." In Greek, that goes like this: "En arche en hologos, kai hologos, en proston theon, kai theos en hologos." Now, the passage where John writes, "In the beginning was the Word," and arche en hologos, what he's trying to say is that there was a time of the beginning, and at that time, the Word already was. And of course, this is speaking about Jesus' eternality, his divinity, that he has always existed as the Son. Now, how does this relate to the virgin birth or the birth narrative? Well, this is where we get into John's special flourish. Now, in John 1:14, we read this: "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." And of course, in Greek, that's kai halagos sarx egeneto, kai eskenosen, en hemon, kai ethiasametha, ten doxon autu, doxonos monogonus, parapatros, pleres, caritas, kai aletheus. And the Word became flesh. Kai halaga sarx egeneto. And why is that important? Well, egeneto is what we would call the aorist tense, which is for English basically the past tense. But what it means is that there was a definite moment in which this event happened. There was a time before where it hadn't happened, and it has since moved on. Egeneto means came into being. The Word became flesh. It came into being. There was a time after the beginning when the eternal Son came into being in the flesh. Now, what is he talking about? Well, obviously, he's talking about the birth of Jesus to Mary. So you see, by using that aorist tense in John 1:14, the apostle is telling you that there was this moment, you could add in Bethlehem, in a manger, where the Word became flesh. You see, no apostle skirts the issue that Jesus was man, that he was incarnate, that God became a human being, even that he became a small baby. Now, while Mark and John only intimate that, and they tell you it in their own way, granted, John being the one in his unique theological way, and Mark simply putting it in there so you acknowledge that he's not talking about someone that is not sharing in the sufferings and hardships of mankind. They don't avoid the issue. So in no time do you want to let anybody tell you that just because Luke and Matthew only give you the full nativity, the one that we see on TV and the one that we see either mocked or paraded during Christmas time, just because those are the only two that narrated, don't let them tell you that it didn't matter, or that Mark and John obviously knew nothing about it, or that they ignored it, because neither of them ignored it. They both used it, but they used it for the purposes that they needed to write it. The incarnation of Christ, God becoming flesh, is the pivotal moment in which the redemption of the world came to be. And that's the reason we celebrate Christmas. No matter what objections you're going to see online, with friends, in any interactions, be prepared to have a conversation and look at what the text tells you, because when you go back to the Word, you will always find the answer to the objections that you see face before you.